să-l rog pe domnul Neal, coordonatorul rețelei europene de dezvoltare rurală, să facă ultima prezentare pentru această primă zi a conferinței noastre. Mulțumesc mult!
Thank you, Miriam. Sorry, my Romanian is non-existent. Hopefully, with aid of translation, we can make do. I have a very much more humble topic than the value of life, the value of land. Looking at networking, because we have, in my experience, working at the European Network for Rural Development, over the last 3 years, we've been trying to develop this concept of networking at the European level, and we feel like we've got some lessons. We've made many mistakes. We're still learning, but thought it was a good time to come and share some of that experience today with you. So the title of the presentation is Networking, an Essential Part of the CAP. And I would like to try and answer why we think that that is the case and why it will become more important as we go forward in the next programming period, and particularly in this transition between the two programs. So I want to go back to basics. And for those of you who are sometimes puzzled by the jargon of the Common Agricultural Policy, these are the two pillars of the policy. And just to give the origins of why networking was born through the last program, that it's very clear under the former emphasis under Pillar 1 that direct support to farming for direct payments was a much more clear targeted audience beneficiary, and that was taking, still is taking the lion's share of the finance. Under Pillar 2, the Rural Development Programme, the agriculture and rural development measures that we have, much more complex, much more diverse range of people that could potentially benefit and use these funds. And so the idea was born that there would be a very great benefit of having national rural networks, of which you now have in Romania, to really stimulate this and bridge the gap between the policy and the potential beneficiary, and to build up that capacity, that dialogue, so that more people could benefit from the policy, understand it more, and that there could be a two-way flow of information from the bottom up to the top, to bottom up and top down, in terms of where this policy is going. And at the European level, which is the organisation that my unit supports, that the European Network for Rural Development will bring these things together and try to bridge that gap as well, and share experience across all of the programs throughout the European Union. And that's really addressing this broader problem of the lack of connectivity in many rural areas, where people are living on their own experiences, they want more access to information, to knowledge, and they feel cut off sometimes, and sharing maybe with their neighbours, but not too easy to find the information beyond that. And this sense of diversity, both within countries, within regions, and certainly across the EU, how could we benefit from understanding that diversity more, share that experience, bring people more together, get them more connected? What we do then, and what we think all network units in the rural area are doing, is trying to get more information, collecting and telling rural stories. Very simplistic statement, which could be very sophisticated. We could be looking at a very detailed story, an analytical story. We've heard some of those stories from the research side in the presentations today. And I think also the State Secretary, he laid out many ideas about why networking is important to him and to the Ministry. Trying to hear the voices from rural areas of where we want to hear the experiences from the field. How could you do that? Could we hear those stories? Could we transmit those stories? Could we share those and then cut through some of the problems we're seeing in the policy? if we don't understand, as he said, where the red tape is, how can we start cutting it? The administration of the policy, if it's strangling the implementation of the policy, can we get more information on how that's happening? Can we try to fix it? So telling those stories from the field and exchanging that information, crucial to improving the implementation of the policy. And sharing knowledge and experience. We all have in this room, I'm sure, a lot of specialization, a lot of understanding in specific areas. How can we really bring that together? How can we learn from the academic side of working in the sector together with practitioners, getting common language, common ideas? So that's the essence of what the networking approach is, and certainly at European level, trying to bring that European experience together. Why in one member state is something working really well, and in another member state not working so well? Is it the fault of the European framework? Is it the fault of the member state? Is it just not the beneficiaries' understanding? Sharing this can really advance and improve the opportunities for benefit from the policy. So, just a couple of examples to make it a bit more practical of where we have learned to make it more real and more live and had an impact with the league. We have thematic activities, as you have here in Romania. I think I heard that you have 7 active working groups at the moment. We have many working across different fields, and we tend to form those groups in different ways, bringing together various stakeholders. We analyse those rural development programs on a specific theme, look at where we can collect evidence of what's happening out there in practical implementation, and use that evidence to see what's working well and what's working less well, and use that to guide presentation and dissemination of those results, which can start to impact and improve the policy in the current terms and in the future. And a lot of that has already happened, but I think from our experience, when we started in the European network, it was very, very much driven by the Directorate General, the Commission Services for DG Agriculture, that they very much forced that agenda as a policy. They wanted questions answered for their purposes, and they set up the structure of those thematic areas at the beginning. And that didn't work so well. A lot of people who came to those groups were struggling to get engaged and feel ownership over some of the things that were happening. But as we engaged more with more practitioners, particularly in the early stages with LEADER, where we saw real practitioners coming together, understanding those issues, communicating the problems from the field, and found that the policymakers in Brussels were listening more, understanding more. And from those focus groups which came out of LEADER, we had several very practical findings which led to real change in procedure and ultimately into the improvement of the delivery of the policy. And many of those lessons were and are now being used to improve LEADER for the future programme. So I think it's a very practical example there of bringing people together, making a real impact, and improving gradually, incrementally, how the policy is implemented. From what worked well then, in summary of that example, that we were promoting knowledge sharing, we were improving the knowledge experience from practical experience across the EU, and we were identifying the strengths and the weaknesses at EU and national level, which could direct to further improvements in the policy. What we've found over time that's been working less well is where the topics were less defined, we were getting less specialists involved, that there was less use of less engagement of the bottom up, of people giving us the issues, and too much top down. And I think over time, DG Agri has learned that if they let the network define those priorities, feed those priorities, the groups work better, the ownership works better, the outcomes are more effective, and the real impact on the policy is more effective. And we want to go further with that then and link and follow through. When we have these findings, how can we get better at communicating those outcomes at regional and at national level, where you can use those to guide and maybe lobby for improvements in your policy with your ministries and get things moving that are happening in other countries but may not be happening in yours. Another practical example where we started to gather information on specific projects which were being funded with European Rural Development Funds. Gathering those specific project ideas, the idea being to try and inspire people of what you could do with the money if you had this idea, or you could adapt that idea in your region, in your country, in your backyard. We started with the national rural networks to collect these ideas. We started to gather more and more examples. Now, today in our database, we have 400 examples of all of Europe, and we're trying to expand that gradually. We developed a database, a pilot initiative, which we call Pixie. We moved it up to a consolidated database, and now we have a fairly comprehensive platform on our website. But we realise that's not enough. Our website, particularly for many people in rural areas, is not very accessible. Many people don't have access to the internet. How could we make that more accessible, open it up to more people? We started to produce publications by specialised area, on green growth, on ICT. All these are different thematic publications. We realised that wasn't enough because it was maybe too complex and not accessible. We started to break it down into other types of easier accessible documentation that could allow potential practitioners to see this information, think about ideas where they could get funding. The advisory services in different countries to offer that out to other people that could actually use that. So these are things we're learning, things we're understanding. As we get more information, we're getting better at how we break that down and communicate it. So I'll skip this part. But maybe just to talk a little bit about some of the other services that networks traditionally provide. Today, it's so easy to have a website. It's not so easy to have a good one. And we're already, in the European level, running at about 20,000 hits per month on our website. But we know that it's not enough. It doesn't represent a small proportion of who's out there who could benefit from the information. We also know that language is a problem. We've tried to extend that language now, and we hope by the end of this year that we'll have something like 15 languages on the website. But it's still complex information. It's not necessarily targeted at specific audiences, and it's certainly not addressing the offline community. But we've gone through several phases of evolution. We see it as an important platform. We started now to look at different ways to cluster information, because we realise not everybody's interested in everything. How can you make it easier to provide an access point? We produce things like a leader gateway. We have an rural entrepreneurs gateway. We have several gateways, bringing information together in a usable form, making it easier for people to share it and to exchange it. We've realised that so much investment been made in producing sometimes quite heavyweight documents. This was the EU Rural Review, of which some of you may already have seen. That's produced in 6 languages. This started as a very top-down initiative. DG Agri wanted and saw the network as a place where they could communicate their policy message. And much of the information was very heavy, quite complex, very much on message with the legislation, but not necessarily. So it might be interesting, but not necessarily that useful. And we realised over time that we had to adjust that. And so we've started to launch much more targeted publications, which are much more flexible in their structure, listening to the needs of those that really we're trying to target, trying to get it more people-focused, people's stories, and that is all about the quality of the information, the quality of the network that's providing that, supporting that, and then disseminating that. And that's been an important progression in how we have developed those services, to really get the network engaged, so the voices of the network are really heard at all levels. Overall then, for us, if there are some general statements of lessons learned, over time for us, as DG Agri has understood that it didn't have to control us every day of the week, that it could let go a little bit and let the network breathe, that over time, as we've got a more flexible and responsive management structure, we started to be able to adapt our work plans more, there had to be much more operational flexibility, and we could be more effective in supporting the network members. That's still an ongoing process. Over time, the network priorities started to be driven more from the outside as much as they were from the centre. So both agendas being somehow brought together. And recognition that the many voices of the network don't have to be in any way the voice of DG Agri, or in the case of the Romanian network, don't have to be the voice of the ministry. That it can be not quite a free spirit, it is that bridge and that gap, but it is something that can allow this exchange without it being an official policy position, and really a debate under which you can have real outcomes that can affect and improve the policy. And we've seen a much greater engagement of policymakers in the process because of that, because they don't feel challenged, but they feel that they're getting something from it. What's worked less well is that the formal structure at EU level is quite constraining, so we don't always get the engagement of the right people in the room, and that is a problem, something we're trying to address. And often, the work that we're doing on policy is often 2 steps behind when the policy is actually being decided. So the CAP reform process of now, many subjects that we were tackling were good, positive, important, but many of the decisions were already being made in legislation and we've missed the boat. We hope that as we come closer to the next programme round, that will close that gap, that the network will become more integrated, more involved in how we affect the policy, how we improve the programme, and have more direct impact. And also the need to go further and get into the regions, meaning that policy does not happen in Brussels, in Bucharest. It happens out there in the regions. How can we get this information more directly there, not just from the national networks, but directly from the European level to the regions? Something we think is important. Just this little diagram, you can't really see what's in the boxes, it's not so important. This is my world. We sit in the support unit in Brussels, working for the European network, trying to provide various services. And around there are stakeholder groups, the DG Agri individual unit within the structure of the DG Agri, but the different subparts of DG Agri. Very hard to deal and please all of them. They all have different agendas, different directions. All of the managing authorities, the national rural networks, the European organisations. I work for a consultancy company. They all have an agenda. They all have a lobbying platform. They all want something from the network. Trying to marry those interests, make sure that they can deliver and make an active dialogue within the network, an important part of what we do in trying to manage that process. And it takes time to build those relationships and make them effective. So, taking something from, this is a bit of a silly analogy possibly, but it's from marriage guidance counselling, because this is networking in its purest sense, that when these things start, as networks start, as we learned in our evolution over the last years, that as a network comes along, it challenges that institutional structure. And in many cases, we've seen that when DG Agri certainly didn't really want it to do anything other than what it told it to do. So it was in denial. It didn't really want to accept what this thing was offering. As it started to understand its potential, its capacity, there was still resistance, pulling either way, but ultimately there was progress, there was greater understanding, there was each testing each other about where this network could go. Could it be a challenge? Could it be an opportunity? Ultimately, we start to get into exploration of what it could really do, achieve more through working groups, and finally then a greater commitment, more of a partnership. Like any good marriage, it has its frictions, but ultimately it's going in the same direction. It's sharing the journey, and it's finding its way and finding its role. We still have arguments. We're not planning divorce. We're trying to go forward. And I think it shows really how the institution can change and be changed and accept change moving forward at some fairly significant levels in policy. So we've mapped out over time, I'm not sure if you can see that, but network growth and maturity is very much linked to the level of participation and the engagement of people within the network. And that through that, you really need to understand the needs of the network. And you can only do that over time because they're so diverse. But you've really got to get more evidence-based research which drives the network, feeds the network, and makes it better at doing what it's doing. And to create more common ownership between the outcomes, between the activities. And that very much links to the support unit which is behind it. That it must have good allocation of resources. Networking is expensive. To bring people together like this costs real money. The organisation behind such an event is enormous, but it can pay dividends over time. The allocation and the flexible use of those resources is a critical part of growing a network. That the development of network experience, again, it's not something you can take off the street. You learn by doing, you learn by making mistakes, you learn by different engagement of the different players. And you develop gradually a core capacity to manage the unit, to manage the network, and to build those relationships. And all of that feeding to long-term partnerships in which the rural development programs are implemented. Where today then is Romania? We've just really, in this last year, accelerated that whole process. We have a very strong support unit in place. We've already heard lots of compliments today about the work that it's already started to do. It's on its path. It's probably lower down in the graph because it's new. But it is doing good work, and it will help to answer many of the questions that were posed by the speakers that were there speaking earlier today. So I think it's important also to see that in the context of where it's going, that there is this transition period coming, and that your unit in place now will be going forward for 3-4 years. And that will be so crucial to making sure that the next program works. Because the future of networking under the cap is growing, for sure. That there is going to be increased investment in consolidation at the EU level. The European network will continue, as will the national rural networks, and they will probably expand. And there will be the launch of a new European innovation partnership, which will look at this connection between agricultural research and direct investment in development of agriculture. There is certainly a greater commitment to build on the current program experience in networking, the capacity and the achievements of member states, and to go further with that as we build the institutional memory. And more opportunities to link between the network activities with the policy and the programming activities, so that the policy will develop with the insights from the field, from that practical experience of actually seeing the policy in action. So I think there clearly is then at European level certainly, and hopefully growing in the member states level, overcoming the scepticism of these networks that they are expensive, but they do produce gradual results, that they will give benefits, but it will take time. But they can be very tangible benefits, and they can be very far-reaching in their impact in rural areas. So I hope it's an opportunity now in a forum like this to begin and build that process, because networks will definitely become more important. Thank you.